2,000 years after the Battle of Yavin, the Jedi and the Force are little more than a distant memory. A scavenger spaceship, crewed by Ronan Vex and Cara Ryn, stumbles upon a long-forgotten sector of the universe, entering the atmosphere of a planet known only as the Sixth in a system of 11. As the ship breaks through the thick fog encircling the planet, Ronan and Cara gaze in stunned silence at the sight before them, a planet entirely covered by a sprawling cityscape that stretches endlessly in every direction. Towering skyscrapers of durasteel and glass pierce the sky like needles, some reaching so high they vanish into the haze of the upper atmosphere. Cara, still awestruck, finally breaks the silence. "What is this place? There must be loads of valuable finds here." Ronan shakes his head. "I have no idea, but we found it, so it's ours. We'd better find somewhere to land and investigate. We're going to be rich." They eventually settle the ship near an immense temple structure nestled within the cityscape. The building stands tall, with 5 distinct spires reaching into the sky, the central spire towering above the rest. "This looks like a good place to start," Ronan says. Cara grins. "I can feel the credits lining my pockets already." As they approach the massive entrance of the temple, Ronan conducts a full scan of the area with a handheld device. "No life signs at all, baby. It's all ours." They step inside, and Ronan starts brushing dirt and vines away from an old, faded sign. Cara leans in and reads the ancient inscription. It's written in an old language, something about Jedi and the planet Coruscant. Ronan shrugs dismissively. "Never heard of either, but it's ours now." They begin gathering items of value near the entrance of the temple. Cara suddenly draws Ronan's attention to a remarkable find. "Look what I've got." She reveals a rusty old 3PO series protocol droid. "Wow, that's some ancient tech," Ronan says, eyeing it. "Think it still works? Let's boot it up. It could be worth some serious credits." The droid's internal systems whir to life, its eyes flickering on. "Hello, I am a 3PO series protocol droid. How can I be of service?" Ronan and Cara take a cautious step back, exchanging astonished looks. "Now that's some next-level stuff," Cara murmurs. "What should we ask it?" A sly grin spreads across Ronan's face. "It'll know where all the valuable stuff is. Let's start with the basics. Hey, droid, where are we?" The droid responds, "You are on the planet Coruscant, in the Jedi Temple." Cara frowns in confusion. "What are the Jedi?" "They were the keepers of balance and order in the galaxy for thousands of years," the droid replies. Ronan scoffs. "Well, they didn't do a very good job, did they? The galaxy is about to be overrun by the Voidborn. And where are these keepers of balance now? Nowhere. No one is coming to save us." "Stop your whining," Cara snaps. "Always going on about impending doom. Let's focus." "Droid, tell us more about the Jedi. What could they do? How powerful were they?" The droid launches into a detailed explanation of the Jedi, their battles against the Sith, and their legendary weapon, the lightsaber. The two scavengers listen, captivated. "Who was the most powerful Jedi in history?" Ronan asks, leaning in. The droid pauses, as if accessing long-buried files. "There was one Jedi whose power far surpassed any before him. He saved the balance of the universe countless times. His name was Soren Ward, the Jedi who could control time and space, abilities unheard of within the Order. Some of the records are corrupted. Little else is known about Soren." Ronan and Cara exchange a look of astonishment. "Now that sounds like someone who could help, especially with the galaxy on the brink of being swallowed by the Voidborn," Cara says softly. At that moment, the scene shifts to a darkened cave. A man sits in a meditation pose wearing green Jedi robes and a mask, with swirling emerald energy radiating from him. Soren Ward is being called upon by the Force once more. Soren Ward stirred from the depths of his long meditative trance, his muscles stiff, his mind slowly returning to clarity. He removed his mask. The cave around him, once alive with the vibrant energy of the Force, now felt hollow and still. He blinked, his eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through cracks in the ancient stone walls. He could feel it immediately. Something was wrong. The weight of the galaxy's imbalance pressed down on him, heavy and undeniable. The burden of responsibility settled on his shoulders. a familiar companion. The Force had called him back, and though he had no clear understanding of the current threat, he instinctively knew it was as dire as any he had faced before. Soren's first thoughts drifted to his past, to the life he had once known, so bright, so full of promise. He recalled her face, his love, a time when hope and possibility seemed endless. But that life was gone, and with a deep breath, he pulled himself away from the memories. He checked the year on his wrist device, expecting a few decades at most to have passed during his deep meditation. But as the numbers displayed on the screen, his heart sank. 2,000 years, 2 millennia had slipped by, and the universe he once fought to protect had been lost to time. He stood motionless, the reality sinking in. The Force really does have a sense of humor, he muttered under his breath, regaining his composure. There was no time for grief, no space for shock. The Force had reawakened him for a reason, and it would soon reveal why. Moving quickly, Soren began booting up the systems embedded in the ancient technology within his ship. The small vessel, hidden deep within this forgotten cave, was one of the last remnants of the once mighty Jedi Order. As the computers flickered to life, Soren began scanning for any data that could give him an understanding of what he had awoken into. The silence was soon broken by a sharp, continuous beeping. Data streamed in rapidly across the screens, but the images and signals made no sense to him. Where once the universe had been a tapestry of stars, planets, and life, the readings now showed only vast stretches of darkness, voids where entire systems should have been. "This can't be right," Soren whispered, tapping at the screen in disbelief. "What happened to the galaxy?" His mind raced, trying to comprehend the devastation, but the only clear answer was that the Force had drawn him back for a reason. Something was out there, something powerful and dark, and it was destroying everything. And Soren, for all his mastery of the Force, had no idea where to begin. The Warden. He breathed suddenly, the thought forming like a beacon in the back of his mind. Soren Ward sat in the cockpit of his small ship, frowning at the flickering console. His repeated attempts to get the systems operational had failed. The ship, buried deep within the cave he had chosen centuries ago as the perfect place to remain hidden, was as lifeless as the galaxy seemed to be. He stared at the unresponsive controls and sighed. There was only one option left. He had to climb out. The irony wasn't lost on him. "You really do have a sense of humor, don't you?" he muttered to the Force, echoing his earlier thought. This cave, hidden halfway down a massive sinkhole on the planet Mandalia, had once been his sanctuary, the perfect place to never be found. Now, it was his prison. Gathering his things, he packed what little he could carry. His lightsaber, a few survival tools, and some data chips, relics from another time. He cast one last glance at the ship, knowing it might never fly again, before turning toward the cave's entrance. As he approached the exit, Soren paused for a moment, marveling at the sight before him. The sinkhole had its own thriving ecosystem. Vines stretched upward toward the faint sunlight, trees grew along the walls, and strange plants dotted the ground, thriving in this hidden world. It was a far cry from what he remembered. When he first arrived, the sinkhole had been barren, but after 2 millennia, life had taken over. Soren smiled softly to himself. Life always finds a way. Taking a deep breath, he stepped out onto the cliff edge. "Onwards and upwards, I suppose," he muttered, looking up at the towering walls of the sinkhole. The climb would be long and dangerous, but there was no other way. Hours passed as he ascended, his muscles burning from exertion. Soren had once been used to such physical challenges, but 2,000 years had taken their toll. Still, he pushed forward, his grip firm and steady as he pulled himself higher. The Force, ever his guide, flowed through him, lending him strength when he needed it most. Finally, he reached the surface. Pulling himself over the edge, Soren expected to see the dense forests that had once surrounded the sinkhole, but what greeted him was something else entirely. The land was barren, scorched. The trees were gone, the vibrant greenery replaced with desolation. The sky above was a dull gray, the air thick with dust and ash. He turned back to the sinkhole below, where life still thrived and confusion clouded his mind. How is that even possible? He murmured to himself. The stark contrast between the lush ecosystem within the sinkhole and the devastation on the surface made no sense, but there was no time to dwell on it. The galaxy had changed, and he needed to find out why. Soren activated his wrist device, taking readings from the planet's surface. The sensors beeped softly, showing signs of several large settlements nearby. He narrowed his focus on the closest one. It wasn't far, perhaps a few days' walk. He glanced at the barren wasteland again, then down at his supplies. Checking his water reserves, Soren realized he had just enough to make the trek. With the landscape so harsh and unforgiving, he would have to ration carefully. Adjusting his pack, he started walking, his boots crunching against the scorched ground. Each step echoed in the silence of the wasteland. He didn't know what awaited him at the settlement, but he knew one thing. The galaxy was in ruins, and he was running out of time to figure out why. The Force had called him back for a reason. Whatever darkness now gripped the galaxy, Soren Ward would face it, just as he had countless times before. As Soren trudged across the endless wasteland, his eyes caught sight of something barely visible on the horizon, a small camp, half hidden by the heat haze rising from the scorched ground. Expecting it to be one of the Mandalorian giants' camps, he approached cautiously. But as he drew closer, he realized something was off. The camp was far too small, its makeshift shelters clustered in a pitiful attempt to shield its inhabitants from the harsh elements. Suddenly, a ripple of alarm swept through the camp. Several figures, barely more than silhouettes at first, emerged from the tattered shelters, clutching worn tools and scavenged weapons. Soren could see now that they were a diverse group, a mix of species from across the galaxy. Each of them wore tattered rags, their faces gaunt and eyes hollow from malnutrition. Their appearances betrayed a life of hardship, one that likely held little comfort or security. The beings stumbled forward, but as they drew near, their eyes locked onto Soren, and they froze, their expressions twisting into terror. "No, please!" One of them, a wiry Twi'lek, cried out, his voice raw with fear. "Spare us! Don't take our souls!" Others joined in, pleading and backing away from Soren, their voices trembling. Some fell to their knees, bowing in desperation, their bodies shaking. Soren stood there, motionless, his mind reeling. He opened his mouth to speak, to reassure them, to tell them he meant no harm. He raised his hands, trying to appear non-threatening, but the sight of his raised hands only made their fear spiral into hysterics. "Stop, please, just stop," he said. But they shrieked in response, clutching each other and scrambling away, as though he were the harbinger of death itself. Soren closed his eyes, exhaling in frustration. "Only one thing for it," he murmured. Reaching out with the Force, he whispered a phrase under his breath, and the world around him fell silent. The camp was frozen in time, the frightened faces before him locked in their expressions of terror. With careful steps, Soren approached one of the group, a human man whose fear had etched deep lines across his face. Soren gently placed a hand on the man's head and closed his eyes, letting the Force flow through him and into the man's mind. Soren pulled his hand away, eyes wide in shock. "How can this be?" he whispered. "It's impossible." Sauron Ward stood frozen, not in time, but in the crushing weight of revelation. His mind reeled, struggling to process the dark vision that had seeped into him through the connection with the frightened old man. "It's me," he stammered, the words barely audible. Around him, the refugees remained locked in time, expressions of terror frozen on their faces. Soren took a trembling breath, then settled into a meditative pose on the ashen ground. He closed his eyes, willing calm to wash over him as he tried to make sense of the chaos swirling within. In the darkness of his mind, the visions replayed, each one sharper, more vivid. Whole planetary systems swallowed by shadow, reduced to barren wastelands like the one around him. He felt the despair of countless lives as their souls were ripped away, leaving only hollow vessels where life once thrived. And at the center of this nightmare, casting its shadow over everything, him. The image burned behind his eyes, unwilling to fade. It wasn't the green-robed Jedi sentinel he knew himself to be. This was something far darker, a twisted version of himself clad in black from head to toe, eyes burning with a terrifying intensity. In each hand, he wielded a blood-red lightsaber, the very symbol of the darkness he had sworn to oppose. He led them, the Voidborn, an army of beings who wore the same dark armor, their faces hidden beneath black hoods, each brandishing a red lightsaber. They marched like shadows across the galaxy, a tide of despair, extinguishing light and life wherever they went. Soren's eyes snapped open, his breath shallow. How could this be? He was bound to the Force, the light, the ancient calling of balance. Yet here he had seen himself, an image of corruption and destruction, leading the Voidborn. In his heart, a whisper of doubt crept in, something he had rarely felt. Could he in some distant future have fallen to this darkness? He took another steadying breath, forcing the doubt back. He would not believe it. Not yet. The Force would not have awoken me for this if I were doomed to be. His voice faltered. The image was too potent, too real. Soren glanced back at the frozen refugees. Perhaps, he thought, these people had reason to fear me. They too had seen glimpses of the Voidborn while escaping the horrors that plagued their galaxy. And with the Force still pulsing around him, he could sense that the Voidborn were far more than a nightmare. They were real, sweeping across the galaxy like a dark flame. The refugees still in their frozen stances, their faces painted with terror, but Soren knew he couldn't leave them like this. Reaching out with the Force, he softened its grip, releasing them from their suspended state. As the power faded, the beings staggered, their terror reignited as they looked up at him. But Soren held out a hand, his face calm, resolute. "Please," he said. His voice boomed with the power of the Force filled with urgency. "I am not the one you fear. I am here to help." A cautious silence fell over the camp as the refugees stared at him, torn between their fear and the glimmer of hope in his words. "What are you?" one of them finally asked, his voice trembling. "Are you not the master of the Voidborn?" Soren shook his head, and in his gaze there was only determination. "I am a Jedi," he said, feeling the weight of those words more than ever. "And I am here to stop them." The Twi'lek and the others watched him with wary eyes, but Soren could see a shift, a crack in the wall of their fear. They began to nod one by one, their expressions softening just a fraction. Turning his gaze to the horizon, Soren clenched his fist. The Voidborn were real, and if he was somehow bound to this darkness, then he would face it head-on. Whoever or whatever his twisted doppelganger was, he would ensure that his path did not end in shadow. With the Force as his guide, he would fight against the darkness, even if it meant facing himself. In the days that followed, Soren lingered at the camp, absorbing everything the refugees could tell him. Their stories painted a grim picture, a galaxy changed beyond recognition. With each tale, he felt the weight of 2,000 years of history bearing down on him. The Jedi were nothing more than myths, their legacy erased so thoroughly that not a whisper of their order remained in this twisted future. This realization struck him deeply. He had devoted his life to the Jedi ideals, had fought with every ounce of his being to protect the balance of the universe. And now, nothing he once cherished seemed to remain. Soren closed his eyes, fighting against the ache of loss. He wished Tevara were here. She had always been the one to help him find perspective in moments of doubt, her words a steady anchor in the storm. But Tevara, like everything else, was lost to the passage of time. "It's just me now," he reminded himself, taking a steadying breath. He turned his focus back to the refugees' accounts, trying to piece together the rise of the Voidborn. They described the relentless spread of an army that engulfed entire star systems, its legions wielding weapons of red plasma, primitive versions of lightsabers. The mere mention of the color made his heart clench, but it was the leader of this dark force who haunted him most. Every account was the same. "He looks just like you," one of the refugees had whispered, glancing at Soren with a mix of awe and fear. Black robes, like a shadow across the stars. A Mon Calamari elder, a survivor of one of the first Voidborn invasions, recounted the horrors he'd witnessed. They came in silence at first, like a storm on the horizon, but once they descended, the ground shook with marching feet. The sky turned black and souls. I saw them, fleeing their bodies, ripped away like dust in the wind. His voice cracked. By the time I escaped, my world was Empty. Soren struggled to contain his horror. The destruction sounded like nothing he'd ever encountered. No Sith he had known had unleashed such devastation, such complete desolation. The refugees pointed him toward the next settlement, where he might find a ship, but they warned him it was no place for strangers, much less someone who bore such an uncanny resemblance to the Voidborn's leader. Soren nodded, thanking them for their guidance. "It's not safe," an elderly Twi'lek woman added, casting a worried glance. "They don't trust outsiders. They've seen too many betrayals." Soren offered a reassuring smile. "I'm used to dealing with distrust. I'll be fine." He turned to leave, but paused, meeting the refugees' gazes one last time. "Thank you for what you've shared, and for helping me understand what's at stake." With that, he set off across the barren plains, his thoughts churning. The planet's desolation spread like a bleak landscape, the remnants of once flourishing worlds now stripped bare. In the far distance, he spotted the faint glimmer of the settlement, a harsh, metallic glint under the dim sun. As he walked, he felt a pull in the Force, a quiet whisper guiding his steps. It was a reminder that despite the chaos and darkness, the Force still had a purpose for him. Whatever the Voidborn represented, whatever connection they had to him, he would find the answers. And if he was indeed linked to this devastation, he would stop it, no matter what the cost.